Welcome. Today I would like to talk about the V-1 flying bomb. Was it really a menace? The V-1 was the inaugural Vergeltungswaffen V weapon used for London's terror bombing. The Luftwaffe developed it at the Peenemünde Army Research Center in 1939 during the early stages of World War II. Initially, it had the codename Cherry Stone due to its limited range. Launch facilities in the French Pas-de-Calais and Dutch coasts released thousands of V-1 missiles towards England. The Wehrmacht first aimed the V-1 south at London on the 13th of June 1944, response to the successful Allied landings in France. At its peak, over 100 V-1 south targeted southeast England daily, totaling 9,521. This number diminished as the Allies overran sites. By October 1944, the last V-1 site within Britain's range fell to Allied forces. After this fall, Germans targeted the port of Antwerp and other Belgian locations with V-1 South, launching an additional 2,448 missiles. The attacks halted a month before the war in Europe concluded. The final launch site in the Low Countries fell on the 29th of March 1945. To counter the V-1, the British deployed a variety of air defenses, including anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons, and fighter aircraft to intercept the bombs. They also targeted launch sites and storage depots for Allied attacks. In 1944, tests of this weapon reportedly occurred in Tornio, Finland. Finland's soldiers observed the launch of what resembled a small winged aircraft bomb by a German plane. They also witnessed another prototype's abrupt engine stop, sharp descent, and impactful explosion, which left a sizable crater. The soldiers referred to these V-1s as flying torpedoes. 5-to-1 flying bomb design and development. In 1935, Paul Schmidt and Professor Georg Hans Madelbaum presented a flying bomb design to the Luftwaffe. This design was innovative, utilizing a pulse jet engine diverging from Sperry Gyroscope's 1915 propeller-based work. Meanwhile, Fritz Goslau, working at Argus Motoran, developed the remote-controlled FCG-43 drone. Argus, in October 1939, proposed Firmführer, a drone capable of returning post-bomb release, working alongside C. Lorenz AG and Arado Flugzeugwerk. Unfortunately, the Luftwaffe didn't award them a development contract. In 1940, cooperation between Schmidt and Argus ensued. Amalgamating Schmidt's shutter system with Argus's fuel injection testing commenced in January 1941, with the first flight on the 30th of April 1941 using a Gotha Go 145. By the 27th of February 1942, Goslau and Robert Lusser conceptualized a design, forming the basis for the V-1. Lasser finalized a design in April 1942, dubbed P-35 Effort, introducing gyroscopes. The Luftwaffe received this on the 5th of June 1942, boasting specifications like a 299 km range and 700 km per hour speed. Ever since the winter of 1939, I'd been closely associated with the Peenemünde Development Center, although at first all I was doing was meeting its construction needs. I liked mingling with the circle of non-political young scientists and inventors headed by Werner von Braun, 27 years old. Purposeful, a man realistically at home in the future. It was extraordinary that so young and untried a team should be allowed to pursue a project costing hundreds of millions of marks and whose realization seemed far away. My sympathies stood them in good stead when in the late fall of 1939, Hitler crossed the rocket project off his list of urgent undertakings and thus automatically cut off its labor and materials. By tacit agreement with the Army Ordnance Office, I continued to build the Peenemünde installations without its approval, a liberty that probably no one but myself could have taken. Project Fiesler Phi-103 gained approval on the 19th of June and underwent testing at Karlshogen, Peenemünde, West, Erhard Milk, assigned the respective contracts for engine, airframe, and guidance system to Argus, Fiesler, and Ascania. By the 30th of August, Fieseler concluded the first fuselage, and the Fe-103 V-7's initial flight occurred on the 10th of December, 1942. Subsequently, the V-1 demonstrated a successful flight on Christmas Eve. By the 26th of May, 1943, Germany green-lighted the production of both the V-1 and the V-2. In July 1943, a V-1 impacted within a kilometer of its target after flying 245 kilometers. Finally, with Hitler's approval in June 1944, journalist Hans Schwarz van Berkel of Das Reich named the V-1. Description: Lusor and Goslow designed the V-1 under the codename Kirschkahn. The fuselage was mainly welded sheet steel, and the wings were plywood. The Argusbelt Pulsajet engine pulsed 50 times per second. This created the characteristic buzzing sound, earning it nicknames like Buzzbomb or Doodlebug. Briefly, in Germany, it was known as Mike for Maybug, and Crow per Hitler's orders. The main components of the Argus Pulsajet included the nacelle, fuel jets, flap valve grid, and mixing chamber venturi. Compressed air forced gasoline from the fuel tank through the fuel jets. These jets consisted of 3 banks of 3 atomizers. The 9 atomizing nozzles mixed fuel with air before it entered the chamber. A throttle valve controlled the fuel flow, connected to altitude and ram pressure instruments. Schmidt's flap valve system provided an efficient path for incoming air. The flaps would close after each explosion, compressing gas in the venturi chamber. This action accelerated the exhaust gases, creating thrust, operating at 42 cycles per second. From January 1941, they tested the V-1's Pulsajet engine on different crafts, including automobiles and an experimental attack boat, the Tornado. However, the Tornado prototype was noisy and inefficient and was abandoned for more conventional craft. The engine had its inaugural flight on a Gotha-Go 145 on the 30th of April 1941, used a simple autopilot. The V-1 used a simple autopilot developed by Ascania in Berlin. It regulated altitude and airspeed. Gyroscopes controlled yaw and pitch, and a magnetic compass maintained azimuth. A barometric device maintained altitude. 2 spherical tanks held compressed air. This air operated gyros, pneumatic servomotors, and pressurized the fuel system. The magnetic compass, located at the front, was adjusted before launch for magnetic variances. Originally, the RLM wanted to use radio control for precision attacks. However, the government decided to deploy the missile against London. Some V-1 South had a basic radio transmitter operating between 340 to 450 kHz over the channel. The vane counters switched the radio on. Each V-1 site had a unique Morse code. It transmitted the route and impact zone. An odometer, driven by a vane anemometer, determined when the target area had been reached. It was set before launch and counted backwards from a preset value. Every 30 rotations of the propeller counted down 1 number on the odometer. This triggered the arming of the warhead after about 60 kilometers. When the count reached 0, it triggered a series of actions, putting the V-1 into a steep dive. Originally, this was supposed to be a power dive. However, the dive usually cut the fuel flow, stopping the engine. The ensuing silence after the buzzing was a sign of the imminent impact. At first, V-1 South had a landing accuracy within a 31 kilometers diameter circle. By war's end, the accuracy improved to about 11 kilometers, comparable to the V-2 rocket. 5-to-1 flying bomb warhead. The warhead had 850 kilograms of high-grade amatol, 5-2A+ explosive, with 3 fuses. 1 electrical fuse activated upon nose or belly impact. Another was a slow-acting mechanical fuse for deeper ground penetration, regardless of altitude. The last was a delayed action fuse set for 2 hours post-launch. This third fuse aimed to prevent British examination of the secret weapon, designed to destroy it if impact fuses didn't trigger on a soft landing. These fuses were highly reliable, leaving almost no dud V-1 South recovered. 5-to-1 flying bomb Walter Catapult. The ground-launched V-1 South used a steam generator for propulsion up an inclined launch ramp. This was designed by Helmuth Walter Commandee Chelskaft. Here, hydrogen peroxide mixed with sodium permanganate to create steam. The system, WR 2.3 Schlitz-Rochelle, included a small gas generator trailer. In it, high-pressure steam formed and moved into a tube in the launch rail box. A piston connected under the missile was pushed forward by this steam. Contrary to popular belief, this wasn't for starting the engine. It was because the Argus lacked the power to propel the V-1 over its high stall speed. The launch rail measured 49 meters, made up of 8 6-meters modular sections and a muzzle brake. The production of this catapult system started in January 1944. The Walter Catapult propelled the V-1 to 320 kilometers per hour, surpassing the required operational speed of 240 kilometers per hour. By London, its speed increased to 640 kilometers per hour as fuel diminished. Launch bunkers. On the 18th of June, 1943, Hermann Göring chose to launch V-1 South using Walter catapults from Wasserwerk bunkers and lighter Stellung system installations. Wasserwerk bunkers were expansive, and 4 were planned initially. Stellung System I was stationed in the Pas-de-Calais region with multiple batteries. Stellung System II acted as a reserve unit, with Stellung System III organized between Rouen and Caen in spring 1944. Each Stellung System location had distinctive features pointing toward London. Albrecht Schmelzker introduced simpler launching sites called Einsatzstellung Caen in spring 1944. These sites were less conspicuous, quickly constructed, and strategically located. They utilized the Walter catapult, which was erected in 7 to 8 days when ready. Once close to the launch ramp, the missile was assembled and shifted to the launch ramp. The ramp catapult was powered by the Dampfversucher trolley. The pulse-jet engine started with the help of the Anlaskirt, energizing the engine and autopilot. The Bosch spark plug ignited the engine, reaching full power in 7 seconds, and the catapult accelerated the bomb above its stall speed. The beginning, Operation Iceberg. Mass production of the FCG-76 began in spring 1944. An FR-155W received equipment in late May 1944. Operation Iceberg, targeting London, started on the 12th of June. Yet, only 4 launch battalions could operate, having only 72 launchers in the Pas-de-Calais area. Since D-Day, they had received missiles, Walter catapults, and other essentials. On 12th, none of the launched missiles reached England. Only 4 did on the 13th. On the night of 15-16 June, 144 missiles targeted England, causing significant damage in various locations. This led to Eisenhower prioritizing attacks on V-1 sites. By August, Operation Cobra had forced a retreat from French launch sites, concluding with the last battalion leaving on the 29th of August. Finally, Operation Donnerschlag was initiated from Germany on the 21st of October 1944. Were they effective? The first complete V-1 airframe arrived on the 30th of August 1942, and the first glide test was on the 28th of October 1942 at Peenemünde. It was launched from under a Focke-Wulf FW-200. The first powered trial happened on the 10th of December from beneath. He 111. The LXV Army Corps ZB formed in November 1943 in France. General Erich Heinemann commanded it, overseeing operational use of V-1. Conventional launch sites theoretically could launch about 15 volts 1 south per day. Achieving this rate consistently was difficult. The maximum was 18. Overall, only about 25% of the V-1S hit targets. Most lost due to defensive measures, mechanical failures, or guidance errors. After losing launch facilities attacking England, V-1 South targeted strategic points in Belgium. Like the port of Antwerp, countermeasures against the V-1 included barrage balloons and aircraft, like the Hawker Tempest and the Gloucester Meteor. By August 1944, about 80% of V-1 South were being destroyed. In total, aircraft destroyed about 1,000 V-1 South. Launch sites. Initially, the operational altitude was 2,750 meters, 9,000 feet. But failures led to a change in May 1944, having the operational height. This brought V-1 south into the range of 40 mm Bofors light anti-aircraft guns. Trial versions of the V-1 were air-launched, but most operational ones were launched from static sites. From July 1944 to January 1945, the Luftwaffe launched about 1,176 V-1s from modified Heinkel He-111H-22s over the North Sea. This tactic allowed the Luftwaffe to bypass British defenses against the missile. To minimize risks, aircrews developed a tactic called low-high-low, altering altitude to avoid radar detection. Research estimated a 40% failure rate for air-launched V-1s, and launch-made He-111s vulnerable to attack. The combat potential of air-launched V-1 south dwindled during 1944. As British defense tactics became increasingly effective against the weapon, experimenting with the V-1 flying bomb. Towards the end of the war, several piloted V-1 South, called Reichenbergs, were developed but never saw combat use. Hannah Reich flew the modified V-1 Fiesler, Reichenberg, to investigate why test pilots couldn't land it and had fatally crashed. Through high-altitude simulated landings, she found the craft had an extremely high stall speed. Previous pilots, inexperienced with high speeds, had approached too slowly. Hannah then recommended higher landing speeds in training for Reichenberg volunteer pilots. Contrary to portrayals in the film Operation Crossbow, Reichenbergs were air-launched, not catapulted. 5-to-1 flying bomb. Aratho AR-234 jet bomber plans existed to launch V-1 South from the Aratho AR-234 jet bomber. But they weren't realized. The idea was to tow them or launch them from a piggyback position on top of the aircraft. The AR-234 would use a pilot-controlled hydraulic mechanism to lift the missile clear of the fuselage. This prevented damage when the pulsage ignited and ensured clean airflow for the Argus motor. Another concept involved adapting the missile as a flying fuel tank for the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. Initial tests towed it behind an E-177A Grief bomber. The missile's pulsajet, internal systems, and warhead were removed, leaving only the wings and fuselage as a fuel tank. A small module was added at the rear for balance and equipment attachment. A rigid tow bar connected the flying tank to the Me-262. During operations, the tank sat on a wheeled trolley for takeoff, dropped once airborne. Explosive bolts separated the tow bar from the fighter when the tank was empty. Several test flights occurred in 1944, but instability made the system unreliable. Using the V-1 as a flying fuel tank for the AR-234 was also considered but deemed impractical. Some trials used a fixed undercarriage arrangement, increasing drag and stability problems already present in the design. V-103 design. One variant of the V-103 design saw operational use due to the loss of French launch sites in 1944, as German-controlled territory shrunk. The V-1's ability to hit English targets diminished. Air launching was a used alternative, but extending the missile's range was crucial, leading to the F-1 version. This model had a larger fuel tank and smaller warhead capacity. The F-1's nose cones and wings were made of wood, saving considerable weight. These modifications allowed the V-1 to target London from the Netherlands. Efforts to construct enough F-1s for a large-scale bombardment during the Ardennes offensive were frantic. However, several delays, including factory bombings and steel shortages, pushed back the delivery of these V-1 South until February-March 1945. From the 2nd of March 1945, hundreds of F-1 South were launched at Britain under Operation Zeppelin. Germany, frustrated by Allied air dominance, also used V-1 South to attack forward RAF airfields in the Netherlands. 5-to-1 flying bomb countermeasures. British defenses against German weapons were under codename Crossbow. Operation Diver handled V-1 countermeasures. Royal Artillery and RAF Regiment guns first moved in mid-June 1944 to the south coast. In September, defenses repositioned on East Anglia's coast. Finally, in December, a layout was established along the Lincolnshire-Yorkshire coast. These shifts followed the changing approach tracks of V-1, as Allies captured launch sites. Initial engagements saw jubilant anti-aircraft crews around Croydon. They believed they were downing German bombers. Realizing later they were V-1 South, gunners found the small, fast-moving targets challenging. The V-1's altitude between 600 and 900 meters rendered many anti-aircraft guns ineffective. Standard British QF 3.7-inch mobile guns struggled, while their static counterparts had a faster traverse. Temporary platforms by the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers proved effective, facilitating easier redeployment. The development of the proximity, fuse, and advanced radars helped in countering the V-1's speed and size. Bell Labs introduced an anti-aircraft predictor fire control system in 1944. Arriving in June, as guns were positioned on the coast, success rates increased significantly, with 74% of V-1 South being destroyed by the end of August. This nearly concluded the V-1 threat. As General Frederick Pyle put it in an April 5, 1946 article in the London Times, it was the proximity fuse which made possible the 100% successes that AA Command was obtaining regularly in the early months of last year. American scientists gave us the final answer to the flying bomb. 5-1 flying bomb interceptors. The Defense Committee doubted the Royal Observer Corps' ROC ability to counter the new threat. However, Commandant Air Commodore Finlay Crera reassured them, citing the ROC's flexibility and alertness. He orchestrated plans, dubbed Operation Tatar, to counter the new threat. Dymchurch Coast Post observers identified the first of these weapons swiftly, and anti-aircraft defenses reacted instantly. The introduction of this new weapon increased the workload for the ROC. Eventually, RAF controllers used radio equipment in ROC operation rooms, directing fighters using ROC information. This silenced critics who doubted the Corps' capability to handle fast-flying jet aircraft. V-1 South had an average speed of 550 kilometers per hour and flew at altitudes between 1,000 meters to 1,200 meters. Interception required. Aircraft to have low altitude speed and considerable firepower. Most aircraft were too slow to intercept a V-1 without a height advantage, allowing them to dive onto their targets. Initially, only the Hawker Tempest had the required speed to counter V-1S. When attacks started in mid-June 1944, despite early failures, refined techniques enabled successful interceptions and the destruction of V-1 South by utilizing airflow over the interceptor's wing. By September, over 100 Tempest aircraft were operational, and various aircraft models were modified for effectiveness against V-1 South. Diver patrols. Nighttime interventions didn't require radar as V-1 engines were audible and visible from a distance. Adjustments were made to aircraft weapons, increasing the chances of successful interceptions. These interventions, called diver patrols, were dangerous due to the V-1's resilient structure and the risk of detonating its warhead. Daylight pursuits of V-1 South were often chaotic and typically failed until a specialized defense zone was established. Here, only the fastest fighters operated. FLJG Musgrove, with a No. 605 Squadron RAF Mosquito, achieved the first V-1 interception on the night of 14/15 June 1944. As daylight increased, a Spitfire was observed closely following a V-1 over Chislehurst and Lewisham. Between June and the 5th of September 1944, 150 wing Tempests shot down 638 flying bombs, with No. 3 Squadron RAF claiming 305 alone. Joseph Barry of 501 Squadron claimed 59 V-1 South, and Remy Van Lierde of 164 Squadron destroyed 44. The Mosquito, Spitfire, 14, and Mustang were also successful interceptors, with 623, 303, and 232 victories, respectively. All other types combined totaled 158 victories. The jet-powered Gloucester Meteor was also deployed against V-1 South, but had limited success due to technical issues. In late 1944, a radar-equipped Vickers-Wellington bomber was modified for use as an airborne early warning and control aircraft, flying at low altitudes over the North Sea. It directed interceptors to V-111s launching V-1 South from the air. German agents, the V-1 flying bomb spies. To fine-tune the V-1 guidance system, Germans needed impact locations. Thus, they relied on agents in Britain for this information. However, all German agents in Britain were double agents under British control. British double agent Garbo, real name Juan Pujol, received requests for impact sites and times on the 16th of June 1944. German agents Brutus and Tate received similar requests. Accurate data from double agents would have helped Germans correct their aim. However, providing inaccurate information was harmful as well, as the truth would inevitably reach Germany. While deciding on a response, Pujol stalled for time. On the 18th of June, it was decided that double agents would report V-1 damages, but would avoid giving exact times of impacts. They would also report impacts mostly in northwest London to give the impression of overshooting. Ostro, another agent, falsely informed Germans about devastating damage in London. The Germans believed him over Pujol due to the lack of aerial reconnaissance of London. Allies, aware of his messages, made necessary adjustments. Some V-1 South had radio transmitters showing a tendency to fall short. Max Wachtel compared transmitter data with double agent reports. He erroneously trusted the agents over the transmitters, leading to miscalculations in V-1 guidance. If he had trusted the transmitter data, casualties might have been 50% higher. Diverting V-1 impacts away from central London sparked controversy. The War Cabinet initially refused to authorize such a strategy. Finlayter-Stewart started the deception program immediately, which Churchill later approved upon his return. The numbers. By September 1944, advancing Allied armies overran V-1 launch sites on the French coast, temporarily halting the threat to England. In all, attackers launched 10,492 V-1 South at Britain, aiming nominally for Tower Bridge. Defenses destroyed 4,261 V-1S through fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and barrage balloons. Around 2,400 V-1 South landed within Greater London, causing 6,000 deaths and 18,000 severe injuries. The last strike on British soil was a V-1 hitting Datchworth in Hertfordshire on the 29th of March 1945. Assessment: was V-1 flying bomb effective? The V-1 was cost-effective for the Germans. Unlike the V-2, it forced the Allies to allocate substantial resources to defensive measures. The Allies had to divert bombers to target VU weapon sites. Over 25% of the combined bomber offensive's bombs in July and August 1944 targeted these sites, often without success. In December 1944, American General Clayton Bissell advocated for the V-1, comparing it favorably to conventional bombers. However, the validity of his report statistics sparked debates. 5-to-1 missiles launched from bombers had a tendency to explode prematurely. This flaw sometimes led to the loss of the carrier aircraft. The Luftwaffe lost 77 aircraft in 1,200 of these missions. Technical personnel at Wright Field Reverse engineered the V-1 from remains found in Britain, resulting in the Republic Ford JB-2 by early 1945. After the war in Europe, officials considered using it against Japan. General Hop Arnold noted the weapon's cost-effectiveness, highlighting its construction from steel and wood, requiring 2,000 man-hours and costing around $600 United States dollars in 1943. For comparison, a Boeing B-29 Superfortress cost about 126 times more per ton of explosive delivered, excluding additional operational costs. Despite being reusable, These aircraft rarely accomplished enough missions to cover their production costs.